Good evening, everyone. I'm going to make some announcements here while we're waiting for the last couple of stragglers to trickle in. Thank you all for joining us, and it's nice to see so many familiar names in the chat. I love getting to know all of you, so it's really awesome to see people coming back time and time again and getting to know everyone. So thank you for joining us. I did want to make a couple of announcements really quick. First of all, I'm really excited to announce, if you are not aware, our tree removal assistance program just opened up in January. And if you're not familiar with what that is, please take a moment and look at the website. You can go to georgiaarborist.org. There's a slide coming up that will have a QR code. This is our new grant program that will provide assistance to homeowners with private property on removing trees. We have a grant that can assist with the cost in that removal. There are a couple of requirements for that. They have to use a truck qualified arborist. They have to live in a certain map area. But we really want to make sure that everyone is aware that this funding is available. Please go take a look at that website when you have a moment. Share with your coworkers, your friends, your family that may be in need of assistance. We're really proud of this program and want to see it succeed. So if you're not familiar with the format of our programs, we will start here in just about 2 minutes. And if you have questions, please drop them in the Q&A. We're going to save all the questions until the end of the program. You can, at any point, put them in the Q&A, but we're going to just hold those until the end. Feel free to talk amongst yourselves in the chat, as we have been doing, and saying hello to everybody, but use the Q&A if you have questions, which I'm sure you will as they come up. Aside from that, if you're here for CEU credit, there is one CEU attached to the program. There's the QR code, by the way, and the link for the tree removal assistance program on the screen. If you're here for CEU credit, there is one CEU for this program, and we will put in the chat at the very end a form to fill out so that you can give your number. You don't need to email me or send it to me. You just fill out that form and I will submit to the ISA on your behalf. So you must stay to the end to get that CEU credit. And so without further ado, we're going to go ahead and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can give him a chance to open up his presentation. I hope you'll stay with us for next month's webinar. We're going to do another panel webinar in February. It will be a lunch and learn. It's going to be on arboriculture adjacent career opportunities. So some entrepreneurs are going to join us with their companies and what they do that are not your traditional tree removal or tree pruning services. So I hope you'll join us for that. The details of that should be released soon. I'll send out an email later on this week with a link to this video recording, as well as a link to register for that future webinar. So I hope you'll stay tuned for that. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us tonight. And we have with us tonight Tim Walsh from Townsend, and I'm going to let him introduce himself and his cat there that is going to be presenting for us.
It figures. We've been on here for 30 minutes and no cats. And as soon as we start, this is Miss Magnolia, who will not be joining us for the rest of the session.
As I told them, we always welcome cats here. So we're happy to see Miss Magnolia. Thank you.
Thanks, Jesse, for the opportunity, and thanks to the Georgia Arbor Association. I'm really excited to see so many folks on here. I know it's late in the day, and for those of you that have been working in the cold, hopefully not as cold as here. We were single digits this morning, and it's warmed up to a balmy 12 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about all we're going to get for the rest of the week. If anyone wants a calico cat, let me know. I can chip her up. We're going to go through, as Jesse said, the presentation. If you have questions, which I'm sure you will, feel free to just drop them into the Q&A, and we will get to them as best we can at the end of the session. So I'll probably end up switching my camera off after I get frustrated with cats jumping up in front of it. So to get this going, a reminder, this is not a formal interpretation of the standard. One, this keeps my lawyers happy, and two, a reminder that only the ISA as Secretariat can provide formal interpretation of the standard. So any questions, you can reach out to the chair or the secretary at the ISA. So moving through, we'll do a little bit of background. I want to just touch on where we are in safety. Or hopefully people have seen this before, the hierarchy of controls, where at the top are the most effective and the bottom is the least. So the top is elimination. If you can physically remove the hazard, then you substitute chemicals, maybe engineering, separate the person from the hazard, administrative controls. And the last, the weakest or least effective control is PPE, which is interesting because we spend most of our time when we're auditing looking for PPE. So that's the least effective. And so where do you think the Z fits in all of this? It's right here. It is the proverbial black line. It is one of the administrative controls. So although we put a lot of effort into creating a strong consensus standard, it is still towards the bottom of the controls. So just a reminder of that. So got to start with the history. If anyone who knows me knows I spent quite a bit of time with Alex Shago. There's two things Dr. Shago always talked about. One, know your history, and two, define your terms. So we need to start with the history. If you don't know, this all started back in 1965. This young gentleman, Jeffrey Hugg, was pruning trees to make some money to go to college. He was 18 at the time. He was shocked and killed. No one really knows what happened. This is often the case with some of these incidents. But this was 1965. It predated OSHA. And through efforts primarily from his mother and others, they actually wrote letters, put paper in envelopes, and put stamps on it. People used to do that. And from their efforts, they were able to create the Accredited Standards Committee Z133 in April of 1968. That group met, adopted their first standard in July of 71, and ANSI, the American National Standards Institute, approved it in 1972. It is revised roughly every 5 years, and roughly more rough this time around than ever. But if you remember, between 2017 and now, we had that little pandemic blip that slowed things down a little bit. And I'm trying to be positive, but we were saying that it's going to be a 2026 revision. It's pending, but right now it's still in the hands of ANSI. So we will hopefully hear more from them soon. Change of name in 2012. It used to be called the Z133.1, and now it's Z133. So what is it? It is a voluntary asterisk consensus asterisk standard, and we'll touch on both of those. Created by the group that's the Accredited Standards Committee, ASC, and I actually blew my first line on the first slide. I was supposed to tell you that we've been lying to you for 50 years. We've been calling it the ANSI standard. It was never supposed to be called ANSI. It was supposed to be called the Accredited Standards Committee. So the 2026 revision will likely have ASC Z133 on the cover. So that's the group that writes it. It's approved by the American National Standards Institute, published by the ISA. So consensus is when we have substantial agreement by directly and materially affected interests. If you ever look at the folks that sit on the committee, those are materially and directly affected folks. So if you do work in this industry, if you sell products, if you sell insurance, if you teach people, anything that has to do with the industry, you have the ability to have a say in what happens. It requires that all the views and objections are considered. It does not have to be 100% agreement, but this is the reason why we put it out for public comment. And if we were live, I would ask people by a show of hands, how many of you have provided comments on the public comment section? And most rooms with 500 or 600 people, 3 hands go up. So we need to do a little bit better on that. The point is that we all have the ability to shape the standard that we are held to. So a couple of key things and how it works. Shall is mandatory. When you see that, there is no wiggle room there whatsoever. If you see should, it is a recommendation. It is a strong recommendation. But a good friend of mine, Tom Dunlap, used to say that you should do it unless you have a very good reason not to. And part of this should is it determines responsibility for decisions. These decisions are not made at the individual craft person level, it's the company. So if there's a should, I as an individual can't decide to not follow. It's up to the company to decide. A should to shall, often the first time something new technology, new practices comes into play, we'll use a should. The example in 1994, it was a should recommendation to wear chainsaw leg protection on the ground when using a chainsaw. It's been a shall ever since. There are 9 exceptions in there, and there's a little glitch, but some part can't violate the part above, so just be aware of that. And then we have this lovely language, unless it is not practicable or practicable, depending on how you like to pronounce that, and the employer demonstrates that a greater hazard is posed. That's where the exceptions and the shoulds come in. So there's some things, and this has got somebody in trouble a few years ago. We strengthened language, but there used to be language that said, in essence, you have to have two hands on the chainsaw at all times, full stop. A subpart of that said that if the employer can show that having the left hand on the forward handle, the right hand on the rear posed a greater hazard, then the company could allow them to switch hands, meaning right hand forward, left hand on the rear. It didn't mean you could one hand the chainsaw, and it didn't mean that the individual employee could make that decision. That's a company decision. And then we have task groups for all of the major sections. Sorry, drinking some lemon ginger tea to keep my voice going. So the other part of this voluntary piece, although it is technically a voluntary standard, OSHA can cite it, can and does. And right now, the going rate, if OSHA cites you under the general duty clause, section 5A1, meaning the employer did not provide a place of employment free of recognized hazards, and that's really what the Z is, it's a list of recognized hazards. It is automatically a serious citation, and the going rate right now is $16,550 per occurrence. That will likely change soon, and we'll drop a link in the chat or the Q&A later so you can go and see when that updates. Normally, it's mid-January. OSHA changes that number. This slide comes from Dr. John Ball. He likes to point out that there's two things. There's unsafe conditions and there's unsafe acts, and making sure we understand the difference between those two. There's the link on the screen, and we'll drop that into the chat or Q&A. Another thing that John likes to talk about as a reminder is we have there's federal OSHA, but there's always state OSHA plans. The very light green is the state approved plan that covers local government. And then the darker ones covered local and government workers, state and local government workers only. The others are federal states. And each of the states' plans can be different than the federal plan. They can exceed it, but they have to at least meet that. So be aware if you're working in multiple jurisdictions that there are different rules that apply. I want to touch on the OSHA tree care standard. There is not currently a federal standard just for tree care. There's one for line clearance, which we'll spend quite a bit of time on. This goes back to 2008. The Tree Care Industry Association petitioned the agency for a rulemaking process, what's called an ANPRM, or Advanced Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, back in 2008. We held stakeholder meetings in 2016, so 8 years later, they're finally getting around to getting some things done. They held a SABRIFA panel, which is the group that looks to determine whether or not a new standard is going to have negative financial impacts on small businesses. So they interview folks from, as they call, small businesses, and I think the threshold is 7 million in revenue, or maybe it's 8. But they want to make sure if they put a new standard out, is it going to put these small businesses out of business? Then in 2024, they were on the rulemaking agenda. It was supposed to be issued at the end of 2024. It was not. We had an election. I'm not getting into politics, but every time there's a change in regime, it can impact some of these things. But I did just check it today, and this is where we're at. And if your eyes are as bad as mine, you can't see any of that. But this is all the information about the current tree care standard. And to give you a sense of when it may or may not be coming, the NPRM, which is the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, which they've said was supposed to happen in 2024, they're now saying is going to happen in April 00 of 2026. I'm not sure what date 00 is, but I wouldn't hold my breath on that. Hopefully it'll come out, but just want to give you a little bit of background. There are other federal standards that impact tree care. Back to 1975 telecommunication standard. So if you're pruning trees and removing trees for a communication company, that applies. In 1990, the Subpart S electrical, which covers the key sections there, 1910, 331 to 335. This is where the dreaded incidental line clearance comes from. We'll touch on that in a little bit. Then 1910, 269. So if you do line clearance, this is what covers most of what you do. 1982, they started the process, and I'm intentionally being tedious with how I'm laying this out to show the difference between the Z process, which is roughly 5 years, and OSHA, which can be decades. So 1982, they announced they were going to put this out. Back then, it was the National Arborist Association, not TCIA. Folks got involved. 1994, they finally put the final rule out, January 31st of 94. And if you haven't read the preamble, and we'll give you a link to that a little bit later. It is the history of the discussion around the standard. So for each section of the standard, they actually have all of the transcripts of the discussion around that. So if you want to learn about the standard, and if you geek out like I do on that, feel free to go do it. If you don't and you're having problems sleeping, go ahead and read that. You won't last more than a couple of pages. 2005, they announced they were going to update it. 2014, they put out a final rule. About 8 minutes later, a couple of groups, TCIA, EEI, which is the Edison Electric Institute. Back then, we were called the ULCC, or Utility Line Clearance Coalition. Now we're the Utility Line Clearance Safety Partnership. In essence, sued them because what they said didn't work. And then 2015, the final new standard came out. So just showing that once a federal standard is created, it tends to stay there for quite a while. So again, another plus for the Z, we tend to do this on a much faster pace. So now let's shift into some of the key changes for 2026. And if you're looking for more information, Dr. Ball and I have written a series of articles in Arborist News, taking section by section. If you want to get a little more detail, please read there. And I'm not going to cover every single section, although I have done a comparison of 2017 to the 2026, each and every section. But I do want to start with some of the key things. And the first one is the scope. This is for arboriculture safety requirements. And based on that definition, for pruning, repairing, maintaining, and removing trees, cutting brush, and using equipment in such operations. And if you see a term bolded, that means that it is defined in the glossary. So if you want to look it up, you can go check that out. And there is the definition of arboriculture: art, science, technology, and business of utility, commercial, and municipal tree care. The purpose of this is to provide safety standards for arborists. And of course, we define arborist. How long do you think it took us to define arborist? You can't answer that right now, but about 2 years. So the definition for arborist is a person who, through related training, on-the-job experience, or both, is familiar with the techniques and hazards involved in their assigned task within arboricultural operations as explained in the scope, which we just looked at. I'm emphasizing this for a couple reasons. One, Dr. Shago always told us to define our terms. If you were ever in a room with Alex and you used a word that he thought you couldn't define, it was going to be a real bad day for you. So one, we need to define our terms. The other is, in the earlier standards, we called ourselves a lot of things. We were arborists, we were workers, we were chainsaw operators, bucket operators, ground workers, equipment operators. So we're trying to streamline it. And the other part of this is we're trying to elevate the profession. And we are a true profession. What we do is craft work. And by this definition, if you do things to trees for money, you're an arborist. Now, I know some companies only call salespeople arborists, but that's up to them. But we just wanted to set the stage that, again, if you do things to trees for money, you are an arborist by definition. I'm going to jump out of sequence a little bit here because Dr. Ball believes that we really wanted to touch on this. So there's a new training and education section, ensuring that the employer is required to demonstrate competency before performing any safety sensitive tasks. And if you can't demonstrate that competency, you basically can't do it. So we're trying to force people to train their people properly, and you can use on-the-job training. You should have set your learning objectives before the beginning of training. So all the CTSPs out there, hopefully you've been doing that. We're recommending, now it's just a should, that you should document your training. But if anyone has ever dealt with OSHA or plaintiff's attorneys, if you don't have it in writing, it didn't happen. Determine through when you need to train or retrain people based on crew visits, audits, et cetera. Document those, provide additional training or retraining if someone's done something wrong, you catch somebody doing something incorrectly, there's new technology, or there's some other reason why. So we're putting some of this in writing to support companies to train a little bit better. So getting into some of the changes here with the drop zone, we know struck bys are one of the biggest threats that we have. The change from 2017 to 2026 is, we said in 2017 that a drop zone should be designated, and now we've said shall be established. And this trips people up a little bit because that highlighted piece there of 3411, establishing a drop zone means we've spoken about it during the job briefing. We don't have to physically mark it yet until we get down to 3411.2, where we're saying now you should establish of visible marking for drop zones. And the previous version, we said may be designated. We've also added language around authorized by arborist aloft. So you can enter the drop zone if you have communication with the worker aloft. A few things in aerial devices. One of the things we do update, John Ball presents fatality and injury data every year. So we try to learn from incidents, and we were seeing people putting chainsaws in scabbards on the outside of the platform, and the saws were coming out and falling and landing on people. Some people don't think you should do this, but we recognize that people were doing it. So we provided some guidance on how to do it the right way. So if you're going to do that, make sure the chainsaw is tethered with a lanyard or something. So if it falls, it's not going to hit somebody. And we remind people to bring a handsaw when doing arboricultural operations aloft. We had missed this in the 2017 revision. A few other things just for a reminder, there are two different versions of being secured in a bucket. There's either travel restraint, which means you don't fall out, and fall arrest means you don't hit the ground. So if anyone's ever tried it, there are two different versions, but either one would be acceptable. But just wanted to put that out there. You have travel restraint and fall arrest. Two things to make a point here in cranes and knuckle booms. One, the new numbering of the 2026 standard really doesn't flow off the tongue. This is 5.6.6.11.2.3. I'm not going to remember all that, but that's just how the numbering is worked out. So this is the same thing that we had in 2017. And I call this out because what we're saying is while being hoisted, the qualified arborist second point of attachment has to be to a separate point rated for suspension on the arborist saddle. Often what we saw was people taking their lanyard and just putting it through the hook. The D-rings are not for primary suspension. Those are not rated for that. So just be aware of that. Power pruning saws. This is a kind of a fun one because it's a whole big discussion around this. This is addressing all of the tools that have shown up that were primarily, but not all, a lot of them were designed for homeowners. They're small, battery operated. Some of them are only designed to have one hand on it, but there's a very clear definition difference between a power pruning saw, which is what these are, and a chainsaw per the ANSI B175 standard. What we're doing here is recognizing that some of these tools are out there. They might show up in the workplace. Some of them do have space for two hands, and we want to make sure that people are using two hands on that saw. So if you're going to use those, make sure it was designed for two-handed use and make sure you're putting both hands on it. Couple of key things in arborist ropes and arborist equipment. I'll go backwards here. One, we've lowered the breaking strength of climbing lines. It used to be 5,400 pounds for climbing lines, and there's been a little bit of a discussion and debate around where that number came from. We don't know for sure, but we dropped it. Does that seem logical to lower the breaking strength? Again, you can't answer that, so I will. It does because all of the hardware breaking strengths are 5,000 pounds, and we were getting people confused between cordage and hardware, so we've lowered it to 5,000. Why none of us are too worried about that is if you know the strength of most of the climbing lines far exceeds that. They're 6, 7, 8, 9,000 pounds. So something to note. The other is we've changed this around to have a minimum diameter of 11 millimeters or 0.44 inches. Now, we've had language in there before allowing the use of ropes that are less than half inch, but for those of us in the line clearance world, that was a violation. 29 CFR 1910-269 R7I climbing lines need to be at least 1/2 inch. So if you were using 11 mil, 11.4, 11.7 ropes, you could have been cited under, if you're doing line clearance, you could have been cited by OSHA if they were aware of it. Interesting thing to note, their standard requires 1/2 inch diameter, but only 2,300 pounds breaking strength. So if you are doing line clearance and you're worried about getting cited, don't worry. The work's been done for you. The Utility Line Clearance Safety Partnership worked with an outside law firm and wrote a interpretation letter for OSHA. And we'll drop this link into the chat later. And what it says is if you're doing line clearance work, which we will describe or define in a little bit, and you're using a rope that's less than 1/2 inch, you and OSHA recognize that the citation would be what's called a de minimis, meaning there's no dollar value, and you can never be cited for a repeat. So it was one of those detailed questions that somebody caught, but we wanted to make sure that we're doing it right. So this is the first time that we've seen this in writing, at least that I have, saying do not use steel core lanyards in proximity, which has a very specific definition, meaning within 10 feet of electric lines. A lot of folks thought that this was always a rule, a standard. It was not. We discussed this, and I will challenge a little bit while I don't disagree with this, because I do know the steel cores, especially the ones that have the heaviest waged end, there might be a greater potential for them to swing into a line and create a path to ground. But if you and if I have a steel core lanyard, you have a rope lanyard, and your rope lanyard and my steel core lanyard create a path to ground, we both die at the exact same time. But I just wanted to point that out. Be aware. In the rigging section, this is actually a piece that'll probably show back up in section 3, general safety. What we're saying here is we want to have somebody maintain control of the drop zone and communicate to the worker aloft. In the old days, someone would yell whatever you choose to yell, headache, stand clear, something, and then a bunch of people on the ground would yell clear or all clear. The problem with that is if I'm aloft and there's 140 of you on the ground, I have to be sure I've heard all 140 of you. And now instead, what we're doing is during the job briefing, I'm going to say, hey, Jacob McClellan, I want you to be my voice. So when I say stand clear, Jacob looks around the drop zone. When it's clear, he calls back to me. And if I don't hear Jacob's voice, I don't make the cut. Another thing I've seen with this during trainings, I've seen somebody aloft in a tree and the person facing away from them playing on their phone, the person aloft says stand clear, and the person not watching says all clear. So this section will probably get moved to section 3 the next time around. Some of these things seem like common sense, but based on the injuries and fatalities we see, it's probably not a bad thing to remind people. Make sure your rigging lines are appropriate length to complete the operation. And if you haven't seen Jeff Jepson's book on felling trees, he gives you some good math on how to make sure your rope is long enough based on the height of the tree and your tie-up points. Putting language in for the first time around dealing with tension and compression. A lot of us have been training on this, but we finally put it into the standard. Brush removal and chipping to avoid entanglement, keep material and equipment out of the chipper that shouldn't be in, and manage the job site. A lot of times this means staging the brush, cutting it, dragging it towards the chipper, cut end towards it, and then chipping it all at once. But don't let anything else get into the chipper that's not supposed to be. Ropes, throw lines, etc. The other 969, some of this is standard, don't put body parts into the chipper. And the last part that's highlighted hurts me that we have to put this in writing, but standing upon the in-feed table is prohibited. We've probably all seen pictures. If you've seen Dr. Ball's talks, you know that he always has a couple of pictures of people standing on the in-feed tray, but don't stand on the in-feed tray while the chipper is running. Now the fun stuff, electrical hazards. So trying to make some connections or comparisons, obviously, between the 17 and the 26 revision. I'd like to take you back one other revision. Let's go back to 2012. If you remember that far back, there were only 2 classifications of electrical qualification. You were either qualified as a line clearance arborist and you fell under table 1, or you were unqualified electrically and you fell under table 2, which was just the 10-foot rule. So you stayed 10 feet away from power lines up to 50 kV. Then in 2017, as we were preparing for it, I mentioned earlier, subpart S, 1910, 331 through 335, there's language in there in minimum approach distance tables for working around electrical apparatus. So there was language in a federal standard that applied to what we did. And if you looked at the minimum approach distance chart in that standard, it would allow a worker who is not line clearance qualified to get closer to a power line than a line clearance person. Doesn't make any sense. The line clearance folks they have more consistent training, they have more consistent exposure, it's easier for them. So what we did in 2017 was we created this new thing that confused everybody, the incidental line clearance, meaning the power line was incidental to your work. It was consistent with the subpart S, but it confused everybody. So in 2026, we expanded it, and now don't panic. There's 4 different levels, but they make a lot of sense. So 4.1 is just general, kind of applies to everybody. And then we have 4 levels, level 1 through 4, and we'll go through some detail there. But level 1 is unqualified for any voltage. Level 2 and 3 are voltages below 750 for level 2 and up to 35 kV for level 3. If you were comfortable with the 2017 language of incidental, those two, level 2 and level 3, really were the old incidental. And then level 4 is line clearance. So if you're not confused yet, wait, we'll get you there. So during the process, when OSHA updated the standard, we had many meetings with them. We argued for a definition of line clearance. We lost the federal government. That's how it works. So in the process, they said that there's two parts of the definition for being line clearance. They said there's a projection of a specified horizontal distance. I'll say that again. A projection of a specified horizontal distance. Does anyone know what that means? No, we didn't either. We'll come back to that. And then 4 on behalf of the utility, meaning if you're close to the wires working for the utility, your line clearance. If you're not doing either one of those, then subpart S applies. We said, great, nobody's going to understand specified horizontal distance. So we asked for them to draw it out for us, which they did. So this is what they said. If we are working on this tree, whether we're removing it or pruning it or treating it with some chemical, for the utility, that is by definition line clearance, because one branch breaks that projection of specified distance. That would be line clearance by definition. And they included this diagram to show that, and they recognize that we work on trees that are outside of the right of way, but could potentially fall in. So this projection of specified distance means nothing to most of us. Most of us think in terms of MAD, minimum approach distance. It's the circle and the radius is the MAD. That's how our brains work. But there's not just one line on the pole, there's 2 or more. With the new OSHA definition, what this means is if you're doing any work for the utility or on behalf of the utility, and you're within those 2 horizontal, or so those 2 vertical lines, you are by definition doing line clearance. For most, it didn't matter if you're pruning, removing, grinding a stump after removal, all of that would be line clearance. Where a couple people got tripped up was if you're applying herbicides in between those lines for the utility, that is by definition line clearance. So all of 260, the relevant portions of 269 apply, and we'll come to that. So hopefully that clears that piece up a little bit. So OSHA has different levels of qualification, meaning electrical qualification. So OSHA says you're either unqualified, meaning you need to stay at least 10 feet from power lines. That is covered under subpart S. Your line clearance tree trimmer, meaning you have specialized training and you're working for the utility, or line workers also have a different qualification. So we'll walk through some of the new ones. So electrical level 1 is unqualified for any voltages, no work within that MAD. And we've also changed the terms. Instead of calling somebody an unqualified worker, we're just saying level 1. So hopefully that's a little bit easier, a little more palatable. Level 2 is qualified for voltages up to 750, and 750 is a very distinct number for the feds. That is the distinction, that's the inflection point between low voltage and high voltage. Now, if you work in California, Washington, Oregon, a few other state plan states, the high voltage inflection point is 600 volts. So think of this as secondaries, house traps, things like that. So you're not working for the utility, but you do have power lines near your work. So you could be trained up to a level 2 to work up to that voltage. Level 3 can work up to 35 kV, and we'll break this down a little bit. We did draw the line at 35 because we thought these folks are not around the power lines all day long. So we wanted to have some cutoff. You get above 35 kV, things get scary faster. And then level 4 is you're qualified for all voltages. So I'm going to walk through a flow chart that Dr. Ball put together. Hopefully it'll help. So the first question you ask is any part of the tree that you're working on closer than 10 feet radially. So ignore that horizontal distance that OSHA used. But think of it in our terms. Is the tree closer than 10 feet to any electric supply or communication line? Keep that in mind as well. If the answer is no, then general industry or Z133 apply, and then any 1, 2, or 3 arborists could do it. If the tree's closer than 10 feet, the next question you have to ask, is it being done for the utility? I'm paraphrasing, but closer than 10 feet, for on behalf of the utility. If the answer is no, it's not for the utility, subpart S applies. You next have to ask, is the voltage less than 750? If it's less than 750, both at level 2 or level 3 could do the work. If it's above 750, is it below 35 kV? If it's below 35 kV, then a level 3 could do it. We'll jump back up to clean it up here. So closer than 10 feet, working for the utility, 269 applies level 4. So drop back down, it's closer than 10 feet, not working for the utility. It's above 35 kV. The only thing that a level 3 can do is work with the utility to develop an abatement plan, or what we call DIG, de-energize, isolate, test, and ground. I want to make sure that we're working with the utility on that. So that's the flow chart, that's the pattern. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. One thing to keep in mind, this is another photo from Dr. Ball. If you were a level 1 qualified worker, you could not work in or on this tree. So the service drop, which is less than 750 volts, is closer than 10 feet to the tree. So a level 1 person could not work on it. A level 2 or level 3 could do that. A couple other things that I won't get too far into, but just to mention, if you read the new standard from end to end, and I hope you do, and we'll give you a link to do that at the end, it gets a little repetitive as you go through the level 1, 2, 3, and 4. We repeat the training over and over because we want to make sure that if somebody only picks up the level 2, that they get the same information that they would need. So we do require training, even if you're level 1, meaning electrically unqualified, your employer still has to train you about what Dr. Ball calls the black lines in the sky. So the employers aren't off the hook. You can't just say, you're level 1, I don't need to train you. The other piece that confuses people is if you are doing line clearance, meaning your work is for or on behalf of the utility, and you get closer than 10 feet to power lines, let's say you work 410s for the utility. On Fridays and Saturdays, you do residential work. What qualification level are you on Friday and Saturday? The answer is it depends. You're not a 4. The moment you stop working for the utility, you are not a level 4. Now, companies can train people to multiple levels. So if you do residential and line clearance, you can have somebody dual qualified as a 4 and a 3 or a 4 and a 2, however you want to do it. But just because you do line clearance during the week, the moment you're not working for the utility, you're no longer doing line clearance based on OSHA's definition. A couple other things to just remind people about, because I still see this happening, people get this wrong. If you're working with the utility and they provide blankets or hoses or sleeves on the wires, you still have to maintain your minimum approach distance. The MAD does not change. All those sleeves, blankets, and covers and hoses do is provide a little bit of protection in case something goes wrong. I've seen people think that they could get right up there. So again, you have to maintain your MAD at all time. And then pole tools used in proximity have to be constructed with fiberglass, reinforced plastic. We'll come back to that in a little bit, or wood. No metal. If you're familiar with John Ball's stats, there's a lot of fatalities around metal pole tools being used. Repeating 3 things here because this applies to level 1, 2, and 3. And this is something that we put in, and I tip my hat to one of my mentors, Joe Tomasi, retired from Davie, had been trying to get this language in for the longest time. The key here is that we're highlighting this, that you shall not cause vegetation to violate the MAT. So think about if whatever your level is, say you're 20 feet above the power line, but you're cutting a 30-foot limb. Before you cut the limb, you're not anywhere near your MAD. But as you hinge that branch down, you could violate the MAD. So we're trying to get people to recognize that the work can cause the hazard as well. And again, this is repetitive, but we put this in all 3 sections. A little clarification here, and I've done this presentation to a bunch of utilities. I want to make sure that we've covered this. And this also causes a little bit of angst sometimes. I haven't been thrown out of a room yet, but it could happen. So only certain sections of 269 apply to line clearance, A2, A3, B, C, J, B, K, P, and R. So it happens when you talk for 12 hours and then do a webinar. So only those sections apply to line clearance. The feds call that out very specifically. So that means if it's not an A2, A3, B, C, G, K, P, or R, it doesn't apply. And I'm showing this section crossed out in J, talking about live line tools used for primary employee protection. These are hot sticks, which are what the line workers use. Our primary employee protection is space. It's the minimum approach distance. So sometimes utilities will want line clearance folks to individually test their pole tools. There is nothing in the standard that indicates that is required. In fact, quite the opposite. In 269, they talk about, and so this is R, which is the tree line clearance section. So if the branch is either contacting the exposed energized conductors or within the MADs, they can be removed through the use of insulating equipment. And they define what that looks like. So a tool constructed of material that employer can demonstrate has the insulating qualities. And the key here is that it's the design of the tool. It's not that it has to be individually tested. And if you want to dig into it, here's the link to the preamble to 29 CFR 1910-269. I think it's on page 1040. I forget what it is. But the Fed said very specifically, individual pole tools do not need to be tested. So this comes up quite a bit. And what ends up happening is if you do line clearance work, sometimes you do things that the client wants, but what I will do with this is I will say, if you want us to individually pull or test our tools, I will do it for business reasons only. I will not do it because it's safer or because it's the regulation. Because the moment I say I'm doing this because it's safer and I do it on utility A and I don't do it on utility B, if something happens on utility B, I've exposed my company. Sometimes utilities don't like this, but that's the law. So this comes up as we go through this. So I wanted to make sure that we did address that. We put a little bit of language in around radio frequency safety. We're seeing obviously lots and lots of cell towers out there. Not a ton of information in the 26 version, but we did put a little bit, wanted to make sure that employees are providing training minimum what the hazards are. And we're working with the TCIA and Utility Arborist Association have been working together trying to come up with more clear information on this. A few years ago, the Utility Arborist Association created a public service announcement based on information that we had received, which included time and distance in terms of how close you could get to these things and for how long. And the moment the PSA was released, an attorney from one of the telecom companies called and said cease and desist. So we had to pull the video. We're hoping to get something out there. The point is, these do have hazards. And because of the height of these, most of these are around distribution height. We're working in and around them. So at a minimum, people need to know what they are, identify them, recognize them, and know that there should be a sign on them that shows who owns it. And there should be a number to call. A lot of shoulds there, not shalls, unfortunately. But a few other things with these, a lot of these can be remotely turned off, switched off. So if you're going to work near one, you've got a removal and the pole's right there, you can work with the agency or the company, have it switched off. That's good. The downside is they can also be turned back on remotely. And one more fun fact with some of these, some of them have battery backups. So if you've seen with car crashes, a pole gets broken off at the ground, these things are laying in the street and you think the wires are not attached, it could still be generating radio frequency. So there are hazards there. A few things on emergency response aloft. We've just clarified some things, and these slides come from Dr. John Ball again. We want to make sure that we're training our people. So if your people are going to be faced with a rescue scenario, you need to train them in the hazards around that. And we missed this probably, well, it's been literally 20 years. 2006, we changed this where we used to encourage people to approach energized trees and trucks. That's long since been gone. So we making sure we're training people what the hazards are to themselves and others. There's a flow chart in the back of the Z, and I'll pull it up here. It's a little hard to read, but one of the points we want to make here is there's been some confusion as we've been speaking about this. As you work through the flow chart, if you get to the point where you ask, is there an electrical hazard? And the answer is yes, do not do the rescue. That means it's not safe for you as the rescuer. If EMTs, fire, rescue show up, they won't do the rescue either. And the definition of electrical hazard is a situation or object that poses the risk of injury or death due to direct or indirect contact with electrical conductor. What people have heard us say is that don't do aerial rescues. That's not what we're saying. If there's an electrical hazard present, do not do the rescue. Secure the scene, call 911, call the utility, and wait for the line to be de-energized. So just make sure that you're understanding that difference. And I know this is still an emotional thing. The few times I've almost gotten beaten up during presentations was talking about this, but hopefully that won't happen on a webinar. Last couple of things. If you want to see a copy, advanced copy of it in a protected PDF, we'll drop the link on the bottom in the chat. You can go and fill out a form, and the ISA will send you, I believe they're still sending it. I just checked the website earlier. It looks like it's still there, but it'll show you what the standard is going to say. It is not a legal document. The 2017 is still the law of the land. The 2026 is still in draft, and until ANSI approves it, the 2017 is in effect. So with that, I will open for questions. And actually, I'll drop one more slide and then I'll probably switch off my sharing so I can see the questions. If you'd like to connect, the top QR code gets you to my LinkedIn page. I post a lot of information there. The bottom is just my company email and cell phone. So I appreciate the time, everyone. Thank you for listening in, and hopefully we'll get some questions going.
Yeah, if you have questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A. We do have about 15 minutes left, so please feel free to ask your questions while we have the expert with us. Thank you so much, Tim, for sharing your expertise. We really appreciate that presentation. Do you want to read out the questions, or would you like for me to do that for you?
Sure, I shut the camera off so you don't have to see me staring at the screen. My vision's going. So let's see, one question. Use of one version over another based on publication data is critical in deciding what is in the Z or not. Is there any additions or versions updates between 27 and 26 for specific sessions? No, the document, it's a revision cycle. So there's the 2017 until that one's done, and then it's the 2026. Although we update pieces of it while we're working through the process, none of those become legal documents until the full standard is approved by the committee. Good question. I've never had that one asked. That's good. Let's see. Why would the 9.6 brush management be only a should and not shall for properly managing wood that's fed into the chip or placed in the truck? Great question. This is one of those that normally the newer concepts come in as shoulds, because one, we want to get people ready for it. And two, if we make it a shall, it would be a 5A1 violation if you didn't do it. So it is a good idea. And I don't have all of the notes from that section, but that is my understanding of it. Electrical level 1, 2, and 3, not about 4. Does it matter if the electric line or wire is insulated or not for how close a branch or tree is to a wire? Great question, John. The answer is no. The insulation, and I did air quotes on that if you couldn't see it because the camera's off, is protection for the wires, not protection for you. So even if it's the tree cable, whatever the voltage is of that line, that sets your minimum approach distance. It is not truly insulated. Let's see, did any insurance companies that write policies for tree service provide input about the differences in work practices and qualifications to ensure tree service to electrical level 1, 2, 3, or 4? Being clear about what service the tree service provides or does not provide is becoming more critical with these new levels, I think. Great, man. Awesome questions, John. I have to look back at the list. We have had insurance companies represented on the committee. I don't know for sure. I would have to double check, but I don't know for sure if they specifically looked at that. My answer to that is by clearly stating what the training requirements are for these levels and saying what they can and cannot do, it makes it easier. It should make it easier for folks to identify who is and who is not qualified to do it. One last piece, probably not last piece, but one other piece with this, if you're in the 2 or 3 category, meaning you're not working for utility, but your folks are around either service drops or primaries, the utility still has the ultimate responsibility for the line and your safety. So even though you're qualified based on the Z133, a utility could say, we don't want you working near the lines, and we'll either do a make safe or we'll de-energize it. Make sure you're working with your local utility if you're not line clearance. Orion, great question. And that's where I hinted at that. I will not say the numbers out loud, but based on information we'd received from a former telecommunications trainer, we actually had a time and a distance, but we cannot get any of the telecommunications folks to agree to that. So we're not going to be able to put that out. We've actually working with the gentleman who has written the state of Washington RF standard. so super knowledgeable. He's going to be participating in section 4 for the 2030 revision. So I'm hoping we get much better information. But as of now, there is no MAD for RF towers. If ANSI says every tool shed will be secured when not using, if the crew is long boom where the scabbard is in the opposite of the boom, what is a safe option that a trimmer can do if they have a limb they need to grab and since the saw isn't in use? So a couple thing, anonymous attendee. This piece I shared was specifically for chainsaws in scabbards on the outside of the platform. So we do not say that every tool has to be tethered. It's not a bad idea sometimes to have those tethered, but we're not saying that every single thing does. Oops, sorry, I have another cat assisting me here. The other, this is obviously, these are all my thoughts, I'm not speaking for anyone else. A big fan of loop runners, a couple loop runners. You can connect things so you don't lose them, but that's my answer there. Warren, good to see you. Any discussion of minimum I friction cord size or diameter? At this point, and I wasn't in that task group, I don't remember anything in the full committee, but that is a good question that'll probably get moved forward into the 2030 revision. Let's see, the source for training materials for employers to provide the awareness training for RF cell towers. Right now, we have the little bit that's in the Z. As I mentioned, speaking to Dennis Fallon from the UAA earlier this week, he's working with TCIA. They're hoping to put something out. What that is, I'm not sure yet. Would it be a public service announcement or possibly some type of training? I'm not sure, but hopefully we'll get something out there. Like I said, the PSA was out, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, and really bummed that we had to pull it because there's a lot of good information in there. Do I feel the industry overemphasizes PPE? Ooh, good question. Just curious. Yes and no. And I say yes because as I mentioned before, we were showing the controls. I think we overemphasize PPE from an audit or observation perspective because it's very easy to see. You're either wearing a helmet or you're not. You're either wearing a Class C helmet or you're not. So I think we focus on that when that's not the main thing. Other than that, PPE is the last line of defense, so it's definitely not a bad thing to have. Let's see. Any ideas? Best way to record employee training for a smaller company? The associations, TCIA, ISA, UAA. There's a lot of publications that are out there. There are a lot of things that are recognized by OSHA. For example, TCIA's EHAP program, they get grants, federal grants all the time from OSHA to give that. So that's a recognized one. I would use those. And there's probably things you could Google or AI to get, but just the key is making sure you're identifying what the hazards are, how you're training them to mitigate the hazards, who was present, and who the trainer was. Once ever the boom goes over center where the pole chain cannot be stowed in the holder, what would the correct way to stow the pole chain if the operator would need to perform a task, pulling branches, etc.? Ooh, good question, Dave. So I'm assuming you're meaning like a hydraulic stick saw. Trying to envision this. Again, I would go back to what I did was I always had my handsaw and scabbard with a hand pruner clipped into the bucket with a extra loop runner. I would just use a loop runner and clip it back to that. That's what I would do. Does fruit cover all fruits, particularly mangoes and coconuts? Oh, that's a really good question. I would say by definition, yes, but I don't think we've defined fruit in the standard. Maybe that's some extra work for 2030. Is there information that covers training to be designated as a ground worker maintaining control of the drop zone? Nothing specific. This is the first time we're really talking about it, other than just the common sense thing where one person that you would identify on the job briefing. As I said before, Jacob McClellan's going to be my voice, and needs to make sure that the zone is clear before he clears it. So nothing specific. Coconuts are not botanically fruit, but this is part of section 3411. Hang on here. This is great. You guys are really challenging me. I'm gonna have to pull up my 2026 version with my notes. So it's 3411. Sorry, my computer's been running all day. And if anyone has expertise in palms or coconuts, we could definitely use some help for the next run because we didn't have a ton of people with experience in that area. Come on. Branches, fruit. No, that I don't have a good answer to that. I think the intention is something that grows on the tree that could fall and hurt somebody. And if you've ever been hit by a falling coconut, the answer would be yes. So yeah, I'm not sure. Justin, with the probability of winter storm impacting the state of Georgia this weekend, please reiterate that all down wires need to be considered energized. Yes, all down wires are energized. And if I can find the link, I'll get it to Jesse and have it dropped in. There's a good public service announcement put out by Utility in the West that shows what happens. A guy crashes into a pole and the wires drop on his car, and it walks you through that. So no, thanks for that, Justin. Yeah, assume it's hot unless somebody can guarantee that it's not. Do job briefing meetings 3-4 require a shall written notes signatures who attend briefing at each site? So let me shall cover hazard. We don't specify that, but from somebody that spent a lot of time in courtrooms and a lot of time dealing with OSHA, if my name is not on the job briefing for the day of the incident, I wasn't there. And one of the fatalities I had, the foreman led the job briefing and he didn't sign the job briefing. Unfortunately, the foreman was killed. So a good practice, the best practice is making sure everyone who's on site signs it, including anyone who shows up to the site, make sure that they're read into it, which includes OSHA. If OSHA shows up on the job site and your supervision is there to walk them through, make sure that they read and sign the job briefing before entering your work zone. Hypothetically, if a homeowner is also an arborist level greater than level 1 and works on their own property or neighbors in their own time, they will not be held to these rules, I think is what it is saying. Am I right or wrong? So a homeowner working for somebody else, if you're working your own property, none of these standards apply. And there's good information, it'll help keep you alive, but you couldn't be cited for it. But if you're doing work for your neighbor, if there's some type of exchange of funds or something, you by you could be considered an employee of that person. Yeah, that's a good one. George Arbus has the best questions. Hopefully that's not, I'm probably not a great answer, but that's what I have. So any other questions? I'm going to stop sharing. Turn my camera back. See what other cats decide to show up.
Hopefully we'll get one more cameo before the end. All right, now is your chance to ask any final questions before we conclude. Thank you for taking the time to answer all these questions. I really appreciate you doing that, Tim. And of course, we have the best questions because we have the best arborists here.
Exactly.
Real quick, while you're thinking of those last minute questions, we have applied again for the ASTI grant through the TCIA, that's the American Safety Training Institute grant, which can provide training for our members at a very reduced cost. Last year, we were able to provide EHAP training and aerial rescue training with that grant. So hopefully we'll receive that again. Either way, we'll offer aerial rescue and EHAP training again this year. So if you have a small team and you don't have somebody qualified in-house or don't want to pay somebody in-house to do that training, you can send them to one of our trainings. So look for that later on this year. So hopefully we'll get news soon that we will have that funding again and we can provide it at a very reduced cost. I don't see any other questions, so I'm going to put the link in the chat for the CEU. If you are here for CEU credit, please make sure to fill out that form. That is how I collect your information to submit it to the ISA. Please go ahead and fill that out now. And that should appear on your dashboard by the end of the week. So if you don't see it next week, then reach out to me and I'll help you out with that. There was one more question in the Q&A, Tim, about working as a
Oh,
consultant.
as consultants, we do not actually work on trees, but routinely do inventories for trees near utility lines. How would these rules apply to us? If you're doing work, again, think of the definition. If you're doing work for the utility, so if the utility is contracting you to count trees, look at poles, look at wires, whatever, and you're within those two vertical lines, that could be, and this is the consulting piece is not one we've actually clearly defined, that the pesticide one was just newly confusing to people. That's it depends. It's one of those, if somebody was hurt from an electrical contact and they were working for the utility and they were in that space, guarantee the plaintiff's attorneys are going to come after you with that, as will OSHA. But I don't think we have specifically addressed that. So that is something I'll add to the task group for the 2030. Well, thanks again. Thanks, Jesse. Thanks, Georgia Arborist. Thank you all. I know it's late in the day. You're all probably pretty exhausted. If you need any other thing, anything else, feel free to reach out. But thank you for this opportunity and be glad to do it again.
Thank you so much, Tim. We really appreciate your time and you sharing your expertise with us. Thank you all for joining us this evening. There were the links also that Tim mentioned are further up in the chat. So if you didn't see those, if you are just listening in, those are in the chat. I'll also include those in the email that I sent out with a video link. So if you didn't have a chance to see those, then you'll get an email with that. So thank you everyone for joining us this evening. I hope to see you all soon. Stay safe out there this weekend. Hopefully the ice won't affect us too terribly. And I hope to see everybody soon. Thank you, Tim.
Thanks, Jesse. Thanks, everyone.
Have a good night.